Look at the numbers the Russian General Staff did not want to brief that morning. And then look at the rate at which those numbers were growing, because the rate was the part that mattered. By the time the consolidated casualty reporting reached the senior officers responsible for assessing the previous 72 hours along the contested fronts, the figures themselves were already understood to be conservative, the kind of numbers that staff officers produce when they know the real numbers will be worse, and they would rather underreport now than overreport later and be accused of pessimism. Personnel losses across the major axes had exceeded the highest weekly figures of the preceding year, and they had done so in a window that was less than half the length of a week. Equipment losses, particularly in the categories that take the longest to replace, had concentrated in a pattern that suggested not random misfortune, but systematic exposure of a class of capability that the Russian force had been relying on more heavily than its remaining inventory justified. And the geographic distribution of the losses, spread across multiple sectors that had previously been treated as relatively stable, indicated that whatever was occurring was not a local development. It was a structural development. And the analysts in the room, who had spent careers watching the rhythms of this war, were the ones who looked most uncomfortable, because they recognized the pattern. This is not a story about a single battle that went badly for Russia. This is a story about what happens when an attacker who has built his entire operational logic around the assumption of sustainable losses discovers in the space of a few days that the losses are no longer sustainable, and that the system designed to absorb them has begun to absorb them at a rate that exceeds its capacity to generate replacements. I have spent decades studying how armies fight long wars, and I want to be precise about something at the outset. The most dangerous moment for an attritional offensive is not when the daily loss figures rise. Daily figures rise and fall throughout any long campaign, and competent military systems are designed to absorb that variation. The most dangerous moment is when the loss figures begin to rise in categories that the replacement system cannot match, at a rate that compounds rather than stabilizes, in sectors where the loss itself constrains the options available for future operations. What unfolded across the Russian front over those days is a case study in that kind of compounding, and by the time this analysis is finished, you will understand why the shock among serious analysts was justified, why the shock among casual observers will probably miss the actual significance of what occurred, and why the most dangerous condition for any military system at war is not losing a battle. It is losing the assumption that sustains the way it has chosen to fight. Let me be direct about the original miscalculation, because it was not made in those 72 hours. It was made over the preceding 18 months, and it was a miscalculation about what kind of force the Russian system was building itself into. The assumption was that the war could be sustained, indefinitely if necessary, through a model that traded equipment for ground at a rate the Russian industrial base could maintain, and traded personnel for ground at a rate the Russian mobilization system could replace. That reasoning is not irrational on its own terms. Attritional warfare against a smaller opponent has, throughout military history, eventually produced the conditions for victory, provided the larger side can sustain the exchange longer than the smaller side can sustain the resistance. The principle is sound. The problem is that this principle assumes the exchange ratio remains within bounds that the larger side can actually maintain. And it assumes that the categories of loss the larger side is incurring can be replaced through the systems the larger side has chosen to rely on. Both of those assumptions had been quietly weakening across the year preceding those days, and the events of that compressed window did not create the weakness. They revealed it. Here is what had actually been occurring in the months before the analysts in that room found themselves staring at those figures. And this is where the analysis begins to matter. The Russian replacement system had been operating for some time in a configuration that prioritized speed of throughput over the quality of the formations it was producing. Newly mobilized personnel were being assigned to units with reduced preparation cycles. Refurbished equipment, drawn from strategic reserves, was being issued in conditions that reflected the depletion of those reserves rather than the requirements of the units receiving it. Officer rotation had become irregular, with experienced commanders held in positions longer than doctrine would recommend, and inexperienced commanders elevated more quickly than their preparation justified. Each of these adaptations, on its own, was a defensible response to the operational pressure the Russian system was under. Taken together, they had produced a force that was technically still capable of conducting the operations it was being committed to, but whose margin for absorbing unexpected losses had narrowed considerably below the figure that senior commanders were still using in their planning. The system had been operating closer to its actual breaking point than the briefing slides reflected. And this is a condition that frequently precedes the kind of compressed loss event the analysts were now examining. This is a principle that every serious student of attritional warfare must internalize. A force engaged in sustained operations derives its endurance from two things working together: replacement and quality. Remove either, and the endurance figure that planners are working with is no longer accurate. A force that can replace its losses in raw numbers but cannot replace them in capability, has been quietly reducing its combat effectiveness with every replacement cycle, even though its order of battle on paper continues to show the same number of units in the field. A force that can maintain quality but cannot match replacement to loss is losing combat power through simple subtraction. The Russian force at the start of those 72 hours was attempting to maintain both replacement and quality under conditions that no longer allowed the simultaneous satisfaction of both, and the strain of that attempt had been showing in operational performance for months. What occurred during those days was not a sudden departure from the trend. It was an acceleration of a trend that had been visible to careful observers for some time, and the acceleration was sharp enough that the trend could no longer be hidden inside the normal variation of weekly reporting. But this is only part of what made those days unusual. Because the Ukrainian operations conducted during that window were not concentrated in a single sector or a single category of activity, they were distributed across the operational depth, across multiple axes, and across multiple categories of Russian capability, in a pattern that suggested coordinated targeting against the systems the Russian force was most dependent on for sustaining its current operational tempo. There is a distinction in modern attritional warfare between inflicting losses and inflicting losses in categories the opponent cannot afford to take, and the Ukrainian planning during those days had clearly been built around the latter principle. Strikes against specific categories of armored vehicles, particularly those that had been drawn from the strategic reserve in the preceding quarter and whose replacement would require either further depletion of the reserve or expansion of new production lines that were already running at capacity. Strikes against specific officer cohorts, particularly the experienced battalion and regimental commanders, whose accumulated knowledge could not be replicated by accelerated promotion of junior officers. Strikes against specific logistics and engineering capabilities, particularly the categories of specialist equipment that required long lead times to produce and that the Russian system had been struggling to maintain at the levels its operational plans assumed. This kind of targeting is harder to develop than it sounds. It requires an understanding of the enemy's force structure that goes beyond identifying his combat units and extends into understanding the dependencies that sustain those units. It requires the willingness to bypass targets that might generate more visible destruction in favor of targets whose loss compounds through the enemy's replacement system. It requires intelligence work that has mapped not just the location of the enemy's capabilities, but the relative scarcity of each category within the enemy's overall inventory. The Ukrainian operations during those days appeared to reflect exactly that level of intelligence preparation, and the result was a loss profile on the Russian side that was qualitatively different from the loss profile of comparable previous windows. The numbers were larger, yes, but the composition of the numbers was the part that the analysts found shocking. The losses were concentrated in precisely the categories the Russian replacement system was least equipped to absorb. What happens next is critical to understand because the Russian response to the developing situation was not the response of a force that had failed to recognize what was occurring. The Russian command, at the senior levels responsible for managing the war's overall trajectory, did recognize the nature of the losses and did initiate the kind of measures that competent military leadership applies in such conditions. Strategic reserves were drawn down further to provide immediate replacement for the most pressing equipment shortfalls. Officer rotations were accelerated to fill the command vacancies created by the losses among experienced commanders. Replacement personnel were assigned to depleted units with even more compressed preparation cycles than had previously been the norm. Production schedules for critical equipment categories were reviewed for any opportunity to accelerate. None of this was incompetent. It was the response of a system that understood the seriousness of what had happened and was attempting to stabilize the situation through the levers available to it. The problem was that each of these levers carried second-order costs that the Russian system was already paying. Drawing down strategic reserves further reduced the cushion available for absorbing future loss events of similar character. Accelerating officer rotation accelerated the dilution of command quality across the force. Compressing preparation cycles further compressed the already inadequate preparation that mobilized personnel were receiving before commitment. Accelerating production schedules required resources and industrial capacity that were already committed to other priorities, and any acceleration in one category necessarily came at the expense of production in another. The Russian system was responding to the loss event using the same levers it had been pulling for the preceding 18 months. And the levers were producing diminishing returns because each previous use had reduced the slack available for the next. The system was in effect paying for the response to this loss event with capacity that would have been needed to absorb the next one. And the analysts in the room understood that this was the dynamic that converts a bad few days into a strategic inflection point. This is the doctrinal payoff I want every viewer to focus on, because it is the lesson that extends far beyond this war and this front. Attritional warfare is not won by the side that inflicts the most losses. It is won by the side that maintains the relationship between its losses and its replacement capacity within sustainable bounds, while forcing its opponent out of that relationship. The decisive variable is not the daily exchange ratio. It is the second derivative, the rate at which each side's replacement system is gaining or losing the ability to match its current loss rate. A force whose replacement system is operating with adequate margin can absorb compressed loss events without strategic consequence. A force whose replacement system has been operating near the edge of its capacity for an extended period cannot absorb the same loss event without consequences that propagate through future operations. The Russian system, by the time those days began, had been operating near the edge of its capacity for long enough that the additional loss compressed into that window pushed it across a threshold that the previous year's average loss rate had not approached. By the time the senior leadership had absorbed the full scope of what had occurred, the implications were visible to every officer in the chain with the experience to read them. Operations that had been planned for the coming weeks would need to be reassessed against the actual force levels available, which were now meaningfully different from the force levels the plans had assumed. Sectors that had been considered viable for offensive pressure would need to be reclassified, with some shifting to active defense and others to economy of force. Reserve formations that had been held back for opportunity exploitation would need to be committed to stabilization, which would reduce the ability to exploit any future Ukrainian setbacks. The cumulative effect was not the loss of a battle or even the loss of a campaign. It was the contraction of the operational options available to the Russian command across the next several months. And that contraction was the strategic event that justified the analysts' reaction. The visible damage was the personnel and equipment. The invisible damage was the narrowing of what the Russian system could now choose to do. The broader lesson here must not be reduced to a story about Ukrainian capability or Russian failure, because that framing misses the structural point. The Russian force during those days fought with the same discipline and competence it had demonstrated for most of the war. The Russian command applied the same responses that any competent military system would apply in similar circumstances. The Russian industrial base continued to produce at the rates it had been producing at, and the Russian mobilization system continued to deliver personnel at the rates it had been delivering them. The failure was not in any of those components. The failure was in the assumption that the configuration the Russian system had adopted to sustain the war could continue to operate indefinitely without encountering a loss event sharp enough to expose the margin it had been operating on. Modern attritional warfare against a competent opponent operating with the kind of precision strike and intelligence capabilities Ukraine has demonstrated no longer permits the kind of slow, steady degradation that traditional attritional doctrine was built around. It produces instead periods of relative stability punctuated by compressed loss events that test the replacement system in ways the daily averages do not. The numbers will continue to be argued over by analysts and partisans and observers with various stakes in the conclusions. The exact figures will probably never be fully settled because the systems that produce them have reasons to obscure them, and the systems that observe them have reasons to amplify them. But the structural fact behind the numbers is harder to argue with, and it is what the serious analysts were responding to. The Russian system at war is now operating with less margin than it had a week ago. The replacement systems that sustain it have less slack than they had a week ago. The strategic options available to it have narrowed in ways that will shape the operational decisions of the next several months. And the rate at which such loss events are now occurring suggests that the assumption of indefinite sustainment on which the entire current Russian approach to the war has been built is an assumption that deserves to be questioned more seriously than the public messaging from the senior command has so far been willing to acknowledge. The reports have been filed now. The briefings have been delivered. The plans for the coming weeks are being adjusted in the staff sections that handle such adjustments. But the questions raised by those compressed days extend far beyond the figures themselves, and they extend beyond this war. How many other military systems currently engaged in sustained operations under assumptions of replaceability are operating with margins that have not been tested against the kind of concentrated loss event that modern precision warfare can now produce? How many commanders are still planning their next operations on the basis of order of battle figures that no longer reflect the actual quality and depth of the force those figures describe? And how quickly can the lessons of those days be absorbed by the institutions and armies that will face similar conditions in the conflicts ahead before they discover, the way the analysts in that room discovered when they looked at the rate at which the figures were growing, that the assumption of indefinite sustainment had stopped being accurate some time ago, and that the war they thought they were fighting had quietly become a different war entirely?